Nelson Mandela is one of the most celebrated men in history. He was a courageous leader who fought for the rights of all people, regardless of race or religion. While his political accomplishments are well known, less is known about his personal life, specifically his 3 wives. In this video, we will take a closer look at Mandela's personal life before and after Robben Island. Thanks for watching the Bongani Men's YouTube channel. It has been said that Mandela loved women and women loved him. He was tall, handsome, well-dressed, and he lit up every room he entered. Yet he was also respectful and didn't speak down to females. He married 3 times, and it's rumored that he proposed to others. But not all of his relationships with women were of a romantic nature. One of the women he worked alongside and grew close to was Ruth First, a journalist, an activist who became Joe Slovo's wife. Mandela wrote movingly about her in his book in his own words, after she was killed by a letter bomb that was sent to her in Mozambique by members of the South African secret police. The bomb also injured ANC leader Paulo Jordan. He wrote, "Ruth engaged in intense debate while we were at Wits University, together, who uncompromisingly broke with the privilege of her wealthy background, who readily crossed the racial barrier that so few whites were, or still are, able to cross, a woman whose passion and compassion enabled others, including those from liberal and conservative perspectives, to play their part. It is a small consolation that her memory lives beyond the grave, that her freedom of spirit infuses many committed to an open society, rigorous intellectual thought, courage, and principled action." One of the women Mandela came to know well from her 21st birthday, Amina Kakalia, told her daughter before her death that he told her he wanted to marry her. Her first memory was of his huge frame and big hands, and humility. She was gorgeous, and she was struck by his formidable, handsome look. Nelson Mandela was widely considered to be a womanizer. He himself admitted he had been sexist, while at the same time also seeking a role as a family man, a father, and a husband. In his final book, Conversations with Myself, he confessed to some of these flaws. In a review, The Independent London noted, before he went to prison, he was a legendary womanizer, particularly after he was married. He shamefully neglected his children, may or may not have beaten his wife. He denies the rumors, saying she attacked him. With a red-hot poker, was vain, selfish and young Mandela. He was tall, handsome, and thin, thanks to the running and boxing, which he took up at university. He was a born charmer with natural charisma. Inevitably, women fell at his feet. The one he married when he was 26, Evelyn, was almost written out of his story in later years. They had 2 sons and 2 daughters, and he acquired his first home in Orlando East, a district of Soweto. Evelyn began to complain of his friendships with other pretty women, including Ruth Mandela, his law firm secretary, whom he sometimes brought home after work and who would follow him into the bedroom, possibly not to take dictation. There were other lady friends from the African National Congress, to whom he devoted nearly all his leisure. David James Smith claimed that Mandela was in many ways a traditional African, who regarded himself as head of the family and expected to be obeyed. This is hardly a surprise. He also produces evidence that Mandela may sometimes have hit his first wife, Evelyn, and that he had a child by another woman. Evelyn retired eventually to the Eastern Cape and lived on in embittered silence, although she talked to an earlier Mandela biographer, Fatima Mir, saying that Nelson was the only man she had ever loved and that he was a wonderful father. Justin Cartwright went on to say about Mandela, "The greatness of Mandela is not diminished by his adulteries and his desertions, or his inability to demonstrate affection to his children. It lies in his unshakable resolve to produce a fair and humane society for all in South Africa, a legacy now under threat." The author of the book In Mandela, Ruth Mandela, the law firm secretary, referenced by Smith, also emphasized his strengths and does not talk about any intimate relationship with her boss. "I had utter respect for him because he had respect for the 3 of us secretaries, And for the articled clerks and the messenger, who was a friend because he belonged to his boxer's stable, you could see the type of person he was. He was able to relate to people with respect. He listened. He didn't talk down to women. He treated them as if they mattered. Some of the claims about Mandela's infatuations with women seem bizarre. The Mail, London, carried this headline: Nelson Mandela's secret love. Rachel Lundell, mother of Joe Wood, was 16 when Mandela pledged his love. Rachel, living in Devon, had just finished convent school. She was working in her aunt's fruit store and cafe after having second thoughts about life as a nun. One day, Nelson Mandela came in and I served him as usual, but after he left, I noticed there was a letter on the counter addressed to me. I opened it and there was yards and yards of it. It started off lovey-dovey enough, but before long it had turned into something of a political missive all about how he was going to free the blacks in our country. Not very romantic, really. Then, Gertie came in and saw me reading the letter. She asked who it was from, and I told her. She snatched it out of my hands and threw it on the fire, saying I wasn't going to be going out with any black men. Rachel never saw Mandela again. Mandela's great love, and perhaps greatest lust, was for the woman who became his second wife, who is known worldwide as Winnie Mandela. She was a 22-year-old social worker from Pondoland, daughter of a headmaster, and 16 years Mandela's junior, sweeping him away with her beauty, charisma, sensibility, and evolving militancy. As a child, she had been rebellious and occasionally violent, according to biographer Anthony Sampson. Winnie's father opposed the marriage, saying Mandela was already married to the struggle. Soon, she would join it. Their love affair was like a fairy tale. Nelson and Winnie became the movement's royalty, known for American-style glamour. Winnie was soon developing her own sense of theater and would soon appears as the Amazon of the revolution, wrote Sampson. Not surprisingly, their relationship is the centerpiece of the film Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom. Naomi Harris, an English actor who starred in Skyfall and The First Grader, plays Winnie. Her research was thorough, and she came to see many sides to an often demonized woman. At the same time, she said, there were personal reasons that made it initially hard for her to get into her character. I think the hardest thing for me has been that I don't have hatred and bitterness in my life. You know, there are things that I'm definitely angry about, but Winnie's bitterness, for me, is about sustained hatred, and I don't have hatred, and I don't have bitterness. So to try and get in touch with those kinds of emotions, the emotions that one tries to stay away from in life, has been really challenging. I found that I really struggled in the beginning to get in touch with that, explained screenwriter William Nicholson. This is a movie, and it's therefore about people. It's actually about a man and a woman, and wonderfully so. The two stories do tell the history. The stories of Mandela and of Winnie does also give you the story of what was happening to the country through this period. All of the emotional, psychological, political stresses. I decided that the way to tell the larger story was through the relationship of these two. Before they married, Mandela reached out to his friend Fatima Mir and her husband Ismail, asking them to take Winnie under their wing. Fatima recalled, that first time that we met Winnie, we didn't think that she was his beloved. We had a call from Nelson asking us to go to the station and pick up Miss Winnie. We thought nothing of that request. We thought it must be a relative or just somebody whom we have to pick up. At the station we met this absolutely vivacious, beautiful young woman, and we took her home. But I must say I was not very impressed with Winnie. I didn't see her as in my league, snobbish, or whatever you call it. I handed her over to my niece, who was also staying with us at the time. Winnie spent a week or 2 weeks. I don't remember exactly how long. But one day I found her perusing through some photographs which she took out of her handbag, and they were the photographs of Nelson in various postures and poses, and the boxing ones dominated that portfolio. Then I realized that something was cooking between her and Nelson. Mir told a story about what sold Winnie on Nelson. The two of them were in a boisterous nightclub one night when it was invaded by gangsters. Both of them hid under a table until Mandela put his arm around her and escorted her out. She saw that as a sign of his love and concern. They were only together for a short time before Mandela's political work took him from her, first into the underground and then to prison, where she visited him often. Together they had 2 girls, who had an especially hard upbringing once Winnie herself became deeply politicized. Winnie was harassed, jailed, beaten, and banished by the government. At one point, she was kept in solitary confinement and tortured. Her children were often left alone. In Nelson's absence, Winnie became the voice of the ANC inside South Africa, upholding the Mandela name and inspiring women in South Africa and around the world. She became a well-known leader in her own right, one who galvanized youth activism, including the Soweto uprising when, she says, the martyr of that movement, the slain Hector Peterson, was actually living at her house. Later, decisions and associations she made as a self-proclaimed mother of the nation generated controversy, trials, and scandal. The movie does not sanitize her experience. According to Nicholson, that story, the love story, which is a very complex story, is basically a tragedy, and as the demands of the struggle are imposed upon him, it essentially destroys the heart of his life, his love for Winnie. It was to Winnie that Mandela wrote many love letters during his long years in prison. It was her alone that he pined for and longed to see. It was also her who, as he aged, in her loneliness, began to have affairs and abandoned him, leading to a painful separation and divorce. She was in and out of prison and was effectively being tortured. Winnie was put through enormous torments, both physically sleep deprivation and lengthy interrogation, and psychologically. She was being taken away from her children exactly when they were expecting to meet her, so they would not know what was happening to her. And all of this turned her into somebody who was filled with anger and hatred. And why wouldn't it? I mean, if I had been put through that, I would be filled with anger and hatred, too. And it convinced her that the only way forward was all-out war. And she was coming to this conclusion even as Mandela in prison was reaching the opposite conclusion. You couldn't dream up as powerful, dramatic a conflict as that. Archbishop Desmond Tutu told me about a dinner he and his wife shared with the two Mandelas, who the world saw as an almost magic couple. Soon after he was released, Archbishop Tutu's wife, Leah, and I invited he and Winnie to come and have meal, and when they arrived it was you could see he really was smitten. Have you seen a puppy that loves its master? He was very much like that. If she got up, his eyes were just for her. He really loved her very deeply. Very, very deeply. And it's one of the deepest pains that he experienced, that their relationship should have gone haywire as it did. And so what I'm saying about the depth of his suffering, that it was not just a notion of a thing, it was something very personal. Not to be able to touch his children, always to be speaking to them, with a glass partition separating them, was more than we can imagine. I mean, the anguish of it, you saw the cost. Desmond Tutu went on and said, "We spoke after he decided he was going to leave Soweto to go and live in town. We had a very deep discussion, where a man shares things that he wouldn't normally want to share with another man, about what was happening in his own home, and why he had decided he had to leave. And I realized that the extent of his suffering did not end on Robben Island. It continued, and it is one of the most wonderful things that he should have found grace." Grace Marshall, Mandela's third wife, had been married to the Mozambican freedom fighter turned President Samora Machel, who was killed in a suspicious plane crash. She had been Minister of Education in her country and was respected worldwide as a child advocate for the depth of her compassion, for her eloquence, for her sophistication. Like Mandela, she had suffered the loss of someone who had been both her great love and her political comrade. Mandela announced at his 80th birthday party that he and Machel had been married the day before, on his 80th birthday, when a man known for keeping all emotions in check kissed Machel in front of everyone. It thrilled those present. But even as he abandoned bachelorhood once more, he was still known for his flirtatiousness around women. Observe the film's researcher Gail Behrman. Women love him and he loves women. After he came out of prison, if you were doing an interview with him, he would always single out the woman in the group. The movie's casting director Moon Yin Lee told us, "I've only met Mandela 3 times. Every time I've met him, as old as I am, he flirted with me. And it's a natural thing that he's got. and he's so charming. Cheryl Carolus, a grassroots activist turned ANC official and now a top businesswoman, laughed about his flirtatiousness, telling me, Madiba, Nelson Mandela, is an outrageous flirt. Totally outrageous flirt. But very chivalrous, very charming. I don't deal with people who I feel are sexist or trying to hit on me, and I think he can get away with it anytime because he's so charming about it. Mandela is conscious of his behavior and is even self-critical about it now. According to the South African historian Vern Harris, who is the director of Research and Archive at Madiba's own Center of Memory in Johannesburg, he's not a saint. I think for me, one of his most endearing attributes is precisely his determination to keep learning as a human being, to keep liberating himself, even late in his life. So in terms of his relations with and attitudes to women, he was a product of his time and of his context. By his own admission, when he went to Robben Island, he was a male chauvinist, and it took long years of study and of reading and working for his own prejudices to reach the point that it's reached now. I asked Vern if Madiba acknowledges flaws that could undermine his image. After a thoughtful pause, Vern told me what Mandela told him. I'm an ordinary human being. And then he told us something that I think is of crucial importance institutionally in setting up the Center of Memory. He said to us, "You don't have to protect me." In other words, we don't have to be gatekeepers. He's given us a mandate to go into those difficult spaces, the mistakes he's made, and the flaws that he's carried as an individual. Even as Mandela reached out for the affection of women, he was also very ethical in his attitude toward using exposés of sexual relations against his enemies. In his memoirs, Ahmed Kathrada recounted an incident that showed an almost Victorian side to Mandela's sensibility. A Kirkus review of Kathy's book noted, in one memorable scene, Kathrada described placing an inebriated political enemy in a compromising situation involving a prostitute. However, once the pictures were snapped and the evidence gathered, he brought them to Mandela, who, rather than encouraging their publication, helped Kathrada weigh the moral cost of destroying a man's career, simply for disagreeing with his politics. After much reflection, Kathrada destroyed the incriminating photos, sparing the man his much-deserved shame while revealing an instance of rare civility when none was ever offered to him. What are Mandela's regrets? According to journalist Richard Stengel, who worked with him on Long Walk to Freedom, he is filled with them, especially about his family and his marriages. Stengel told an interviewer for American Public Television about a bigger question he wrestles with. He has certain regrets even about whether it was all worthwhile.
Mrs. Winnie Mandela next to him, waving to the crowds, hand in hand. They leave the Victor Verster prison. Officials, marshals of the National Reception Committee trying to get the people, and a salute from Mr. Nelson Mandela, his wife Winnie, greeting.
Why did Nelson Mandela not forgive his ex-wife Winnie Mandela? That is the question this video is going to answer. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Nelson Mandela was laid to rest on December 15, 2013. John Carlin, in his book, Knowing Mandela, reveals why he never forgave the former wife who featured throughout the 10-day mourning period after his death and was even in the official program of the funeral. 2 weeks before Nelson Mandela's release from prison, John Carlin, the author of the book, Knowing Mandela, went to see Mandela's wife, Winnie, at her home in Diepkloof Extension, the posh neighborhood of Soweto where the handful of black people who had contrived to make a little money resided. It was known as Beverly Hills to Soweto's other residents. Winnie's home, funded by foreign benefactors, was a 2-floor, 3-bedroom house with a garden and a small swimming pool. The height of extravagance by black standards, it would have more or less met the aspirations of the average white, middle-class South African. The picture presented to me by mother, daughter, friends, and cleaning lady was of a domesticity so stable and relaxed that, had I not been better informed, I would never have imagined the depths of trauma that lurked beneath. Winnie had been continually persecuted by agents of the apartheid state during the 1970s and 1980s. She had borne the anguish of hearing her two small daughters screaming as the police broke into her home and carted her off to jail. She had spent more than a year in solitary confinement, trusting that her confused and stricken children would be cared for by friends. She had been banished and placed under house arrest far away. But she was back. Her circumstances altered dramatically for the better now that Mandela's release was imminent. On a bookshelf, there was a row of framed family portraits, a Christmas card, and a birthday card. Only a month had passed since Christmas, but nearly 4 since Winnie had turned 53. I could not resist taking a closer look. I opened the Christmas card, which was enormous, and immediately recognized Nelson Mandela's large, spidery handwriting. "Darling, I love you. Madiba," it said. Madiba was the tribal name by which he liked to be known to those close to him. On the birthday card, he had written the same words. If I had not known better, I might have imagined the cards had been sent by an infatuated teenager. Once we began our interview, Winnie took on just such a role, playing the tremulous bride-to-be, convincing me she was in a state of nervous excitement at the prospect of rekindling her life's great love. Close up she had, like her husband, the charisma of the vastly self-confident, and there was a coquettish, eye-fluttering sensuality about her. It was not hard to imagine how the young woman who met Mandela one rainy evening in 1957 had struck him, as he would later confess, like a thunderbolt. The Mandela the world saw wore a mask that disguised his private feelings, presenting himself as a fearless hero, immune to ordinary human weakness. His effectiveness as a leader hung, he believed, on keeping that public mask from cracking. Winnie offered the greatest test to his resolve. During the following years, the mask cracked only twice. She was the cause both times. The first was in May 1991. She had just been convicted at Johannesburg's Rand Supreme Court of assault and accessory to kidnapping a 14-year-old black boy called Stompel Moketsi, whom her driver had subsequently murdered. Winnie had been led to believe, falsely as it turned out, that the boy had been working as a spy for the apartheid state. Winnie and Mandela walked together down the steps of the Grand Court building. Once again the actress, she swaggered to the street, right fist raised in triumph. It was not clear what she could possibly have been celebrating, except perhaps the perplexing straight off to jail and would remain free pending an appeal. Mandela had a different grasp of the situation. His face was gray, his eyes were downcast. The second and last time was nearly a year later. The setting was an evening press conference hastily summoned at the drab headquarters of the ANC. He shuffled into the room, sat down at a table, and read from a piece of paper, beginning by paying tribute to his wife.
My love for her remains undiminished. However, in view of the tensions that have arisen owing to differences between ourselves in a number of issues in recent months, we have mutually agreed that a separation would be best for each one of us. I hope you'll appreciate the pain I have gone through. And I now end this interview.
Mandela's love for Winnie had been, like many great loves, a kind of madness, all the more so in his case as it was founded more on a fantasy that he had kept alive for 27 years in prison than on the brief time they had actually spent together. The demands of his political life before he was imprisoned were such that they had next to no experience of married life, as Winnie herself would confess to me that morning. "I have never lived with Mandela," she said. "I have never known what it was to have a close family where you sat around the table with husband and children. I have no such dear memories. When I gave birth to my children, he was never there, even though he was not in jail at the time." It seemed that Winnie, who was 22 to his 38 when they met, had cast a spell on him. Or maybe he cast a spell on himself, needing to reconstruct those fleeting memories of her into a fantasy of tranquility where he sought refuge from the loneliness of prison life. His letters to her from Robben Island revealed romantic, sensual side to his nature that no one but Winnie then knew. He recalled the electric current that flushed through his blood as he looked at her photograph and imagined their caresses. The truth was that Winnie had had several lovers during Mandela's long absence. In the months before his release, she had been having an affair with Dali Mpofu, a lawyer 30 years her junior and a member of her defense team. She carried on with the affair after Mandela left prison. ANC members close to Mandela knew that was going on, as they did about her frequent bouts of drunkenness. I tried asking them why they did not talk to Mandela about her waywardness, but I was always met by frosty stares. Winnie became a taboo subject within the ANC during the 2 years after Mandela left prison. Confronting him with the truth was a step too far for the freedom fighters of the ANC. His impeccably courteous public persona acted as a coat of armor protecting the sorrowing man within. But there came a point when Mandela could deceive himself, or the public, no longer. Details of the affair with Mpofu were made luridly public in a newspaper report 2 weeks before the separation announcement. The article was a devastating, irrefutable expose of Winnie's affair. It was based on a letter she had written to Mpofu that revealed he had recently had a child with a woman whom she referred to as a white hag. Winnie accused Mpofu of running around fucking at the slightest emotional excuse. Before I am through with you, you are going to learn a bit of honesty and sincerity and know what betrayal of one's love means to a woman. Remember always how much you have hurt and humiliated me. I keep telling you the situation is deteriorating at home. You are not bothered because you are satisfying yourself every night with a woman. I won't be your bloody fool, Dali. In private, Mandela had already endured quite enough conjugal torture. I learn of one especially hurtful episode from a friend of Mandela some years later. Not long after the end of her trial, Winnie was due to fly to America on ANC-related business. She wanted to take Mpofu with her, and Mandela said she should not. Winnie agreed not to, but went with him anyway. Mandela phoned her at her hotel room in New York, and Mpofu answered the phone. On the face of it, Mandela was a man more sinned against than sinning, but he did not see it that way. It was his belief that the original sin was to have put his political cause before his family. Despite everything, Mandela believed when he left prison that he would find a way to reconcile political and family life. Some years after his separation from Winnie, I interviewed his close friend Amina Kashalia, who had known him since before he met Winnie. His one great wish, she told me, was that he would come out of prison and have a family life again with his wife and the children. Because he's a great family man, and I think he really wanted that more than anything else, and he couldn't have it. His fallout with Winnie only deepened the catastrophe, contaminating his relationships with other family members, among them his daughter Zinzi. She was a far more complicated character than I had imagined when I chatted with her cheerfully in her mother's kitchen over fried eggs. At that very moment, in late January 1990, her current lover, the father of her third child, was in a prison cell. 5 days later, he hanged himself. Zinzi was very much her mother's daughter, inheriting her capacity to dissemble as well as her strength of personality. The unhappiness and sheer chaos that she would endure in her own private life, a mirror of her mother's, found expression in a succession of tense jail. Some years later, the Minister of Justice and the Chief of National Intelligence admitted to me that they had conveyed a message to the relevant members of the judiciary to show Winnie leniency. Mandela's mental and emotional well-being were essential to the success of the negotiations between the government and the ANC. For him to bow out of the process could have had catastrophic consequences for the country as a whole. Jailing Winnie would be too grave a risk. Bizarrely, one of the guests at Zinzi's wedding, prominently positioned near the top table, was the white hag Winnie had derided and had been standing up, turned his back on Winnie and returned stiffly to the top table. Grim-faced for the rest of the night, he treated Winnie as if she did not exist. At one point, Sussman passed him a note. "Smile, Nelson," it said. In October 1994, 5 months after Mandela had become president, I spoke to a friend of his, one of the few people in whom he confided the details of his marital difficulties. The friend leaned over to me and said, "It's amazing. He has forgiven all his political enemies, but he cannot forgive her." During their divorce proceedings a year and a half later, he made his feelings towards Winnie public at the Rand Supreme Court, where he had accompanied and supported Winnie during her trial in 1991. As his lawyer would tell me later, he was arbitrarily generous about sharing his estate, giving Winnie what was more than fair. But he made his feelings bluntly known in the divorce hearing. Standing a few feet away from her, he addressed the judge, saying, "Can I put it simply, my lord? If the entire universe tried to persuade me to reconcile with the defendant, I would not. I am determined to get rid of this marriage." He did not shirk from describing before the court the disappointment and misery of married life after he returned from prison. Winnie, he explained, did not share his bed once in the 2 years after their reunion. "I was the loneliest man," he said. He did not shirk from describing before the court the disappointment and misery of married life after he returned from prison. Winnie, he explained, did not share his bed once in the 2 years after their reunion. "I was the loneliest man," he said. Happily for his country, one did not drain energy from the other. Thanks to a kind of self-imposed apartheid of the mind, personal anguish and the political drive inhabited separate compartments and ran along parallel lines. When you lead the kind of life we lead, if you are involved in a revolutionary situation, you cease to think in terms of self, she said.
When a relationship breaks down, both for personal and professional reasons, I don't want to discuss publicly what passed between Nelson and me and Winnie and me. I'd like it to be part of the history which may be partly recorded in documents and others, but I find it difficult to speak about it. But what I can say is that I know that it was a very difficult time in his life, and I'm sure that it was a very difficult time for Winnie. It is inevitable when one's friends become divorced that the relationship between one of them and you changes. I stood by Nelson's side. I didn't do the case myself because I knew both of them. I played some role in the negotiations between them. But it was very hurtful, and I can repeat what he has said publicly. He has feelings of guilt about not doing enough for his family when they needed his personal attention and protection.